celebration, memory of encounters, in the memory of a great novel writer, a great poet, who, as perhaps very few people have been able to get together and create from these two big rivers, culture and imagination, India and Mexico, believe that well, sorry. So I'm gonna restart. No, we are very pleased and happy to present a wide program today. We have three steps to take about. The first, we are very happy to have professors, faculty from the University of Hyderabad who will speak about a book that is made from several lectures, a seminar called in 2014 for the centenary of Octavio Paz. The second term we will have with two poets, two scholars, and third term we will have a ceremony to award Professor Langudi with the Order of the Aztec Eagle. So I thank all you for being here. Of course, acknowledge Mr. Bashpali and the Raza Foundation, all the team that have made this possible. Of course, Instituto Cervantes, Ricardo Barona, the fantastic team at India International Center, which is the best venue possible to do this ceremony and to be together this evening. So I will request Mr. Ranjivan to address the public.
I'm going to speak in Spanish. So, muy buenas tardes a todos. Dear friends, I'm Ambassador Martin, Director of the Instituto Cervantes, Professor Rao, Professor Ganguly, and other delegates who have come today in the evening. Durante 6 años, Octavio Paz vivió en la India como embajador de México. Escribe que él estaba consternado inicialmente ante la idea de venir a un país que evoca en su mente las imágenes confusas de rituales, templos, ciudades cuyos nombres evocaban cuentos extraños, las mujeres con gracia felina y oscuros ojos brillantes, santos benditos. Sin embargo, durante su estadía, Paz se convirtió profundamente integrado por la India, su paisaje y su gente, la historia, la literatura, la filosofía y la religión, la pintura, la música y la danza. De hecho, trato de captar lo que él llama la esencia de la India. En sus propias palabras, su experiencia en la India le dio una educación sentimental, artística y espiritual. El espíritu Paz también nunca salió de la India. No es de extrañar, por tanto, que la India impregna sus escritos, palpita en sus obras de ficción, la poesía y la filosofía de la vida. Algunos de sus mejores prosas y relatos de viajes se centran en la India, completo muchas de sus obras bien conocidas durante su estancia aquí, en la India. Sus poemas conmemoran sus respuestas y visitas a muchos lugares del país. Se reunió con escritores y poetas aquí, especialmente un grupo llamado La Generación Angli, y se puede ver la profunda influencia en la poética de esta generación. Sus obras se han traducido a más de 30 idiomas, incluyendo varios idiomas de la India. Bueno, conmemorando el centenario de uno de los exponentes Y como parte del centenario del nacimiento de Paz aquel año, la Facultad de Humanidades de la Universidad de Hyderabad, en colaboración con la Embajada de México, celebró un seminario nacional de 2 días con el título Octavio Paz en India, Enduring Resonances. Este seminario pretende ser un homenaje y una exploración de los vínculos entre las dos culturas tan remotas pero que se llevan muy próximas por la energía prolífica y la mente creativa de Octavio Paz. El seminario sin duda contribuyó a una comprensión profunda de Paz y sus pensamientos sobre la India. Este libro es el producto de este seminario y consiste en 11 ponencias de gran erudición sobre diferentes temas de escrituras de Paz. Los temas de las ponencias varían de la identidad y visión artística de Paz y la India en su imaginación a su filosofía política y visión del mundo. Bueno, por último, queremos agradecer la Embajada de México para organizar este evento y estoy muy seguro que este libro ayudaría mucho a difundir los pensamientos de paz aquí en la India. Muchas gracias.
I may now request Mr. Raza to come.
Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, greetings from University of Hyderabad and personally from the Vice Chancellor. I am here not as a specialist on Octavio Paz. I am here as a from the Department of Professor of Foreign Languages, University of Hyderabad. In 2014, when the Mexico Embassy has contacted us to organize jointly a conference on Octavio Paz, we thought it was a great privilege for us to have a conference on Octavio Paz, and we had a very fruitful deliberations in the conference, which has resulted now in bringing out a book on Octavio Paz. So, and before that, in 2012, for the first time, in at least in that part of the country, we have organized an international 3-day international conference on Indo-Latin American dialogue, bridging the cultural gap. So this conference was also a very successful one, and soon we are also going to bring out book deliberations of the conference in the form of the book. And we are also planning to organize the next conference in 2019 in Latin America. The venue is not yet decided. So we want to develop as a university to develop academic relations with Latin America, LAC in general, and of course with Mexico. And recently we are in the process of signing an MOU with the University of Sinaloa and also UNAM. So if these 2 MOUs will be signed, then we will have exchange of students, faculty, and some of the research programs. I thank the Mexico Embassy for giving me this opportunity, and once again, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Mr. Hayat.
I am Professor M.S. Hayat, former Dean, Faculty of Arts, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University, and also former Director, CDE, University of Hyderabad. I am really grateful to Embassy of Mexico and also Professor J. Prabhakar Rao for giving this an opportunity to publish this book. And thank you, Professor Prabhakar Rao Garu and the Embassy of Mexico. And some of the words in Spanish I learned from my grandson who is in US. Whenever I talk him on Skype or FaceTime, he used to taught me about Spanish language. He is in school. I am just learning from him. So it's a good thing. And usually we read about, we call in Urdu as Hispania. We call it Hispania. And when a famous eminent Urdu poet write about Masjid-e-Fartaba when he visited Hispania, Spain. So we know about Spanish language and culture and through Sir Muhammad Iqbal, through Masjid-e-Khurtaba. He wrote a good poem on Masjid-e-Khurtaba. So once again, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to publish this book. And thanks, Professor Raoji. This book is dedicated to my beloved father, Muhammad Hayat, retired Deputy Collector. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think it would be better if we take it there. Back row.
You can just say those who want to purchase, they can write there. Okay. Those que quieren comprar.
So you may see the book at the entrance and also buy it. Now we proceed with the seminar. Please, Mr. Sachinanan, Professor Mini, Udayan Bajpayee, and Professor Ganguly, if we can join us in the panel. In the labyrinth, and I think it's a very special to have different points of view. From one side, from the Hispanist perspective, people who have dedicated a lot of time to understand the language that we share as Latin and Latin American countries and Spain, and also from the poetic side. So I may ask Mr. Sachindana to share some thoughts on the past. Also, we have to mention the fantastic book Raza Foundation have made for this program, and both have a contribution and Mr. Sachindanan, I liked a lot the article, and have my notes here. And it's a reflection of how poetry can help us to read history, but also violence in difficult times today. And I like, I quote, "It is on the ear that hears beyond the understanding of common sociology." That's what poetry is. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's better.
Yeah.
Let me thank Raza Foundation, the Embassy of Mexico, and Institute of Cervantes for having me and having all of us here. I should also thank them for having given me a chance to have a second look at Octavio Paz's contributions, especially his poems on India, which I happen to translate for an anthology which is getting published very soon into my language, Malayalam, even though I have translated Paz earlier, but not all poems of all his poems on India. That was a great eye-opener again. Well, I'm not speaking exactly about Paz, but I would say around Paz. I would call this very short paper, Poetry as History and Apocalypse. Some thoughts around Octavio Paz as a poet and a political observer. Because I believe his prose, his thoughts, his political vision, all these are as important as his poetry. Octavio Paz, deeply impacted by Indian thought traditions, wrote in his introduction to Poesía en Movimiento, Poetry in Motion, an anthology of contemporary Mexican poetry. I quote him, "There can be no poetry without history, but poetry has no other mission than to transmute history. And therefore, the only true revolutionary poetry is apocalyptic poetry." And later he adds, "The poet is a human being whose very being becomes one with his words. Therefore, only the poet can make possible a new dialogue." Pablo Neruda, another major poet of our times, I know ideologically they were far apart, but the irony of the art of poetry is that poetry brings together people from different ideologies, as long as they practice poetry and believe in poetry, and as long as poetry happens to be their fundamental faith. Everything else is secondary. Neruda advocated impure poetry in his 1935 manifesto, Towards an Impure Poetry, a poetry that carries the dust of distances and smells of lilies and urine. I quote him, "Yet the used surfaces of things, the wear that hands have given to things, the air, tragic at times, pathetic at others, of such things, all lend a curious attractiveness to reality that we should not underestimate." He had said in that manifesto in 1966. And again he wrote, "I have always wanted the hands of people to be seen in poetry." And added, "I have always preferred a poetry where the fingerprints show, a poetry of loam where the water can sing, a poetry of bread where everyone may eat." We know how this intuitive connection to the masses remained a feature of his oeuvre right from his residence on earth, and grew more intense as he grew, turning him into a biblical prophet of sorts, the voice of the voiceless, reminding us of another great poet of our time, Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet, to whom poetry was a participation in the humanly modulated time. A participation in the humanly modulated time, and who believed that the poetry that does not unanimously the poetry that does not address the destiny of nations is useless. He had added, "In a room where people unanimously maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot." He warned the wrongdoers, "You who have wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at his suffering, do not feel safe." The poet remembers, "You may kill him, a new one will be born. Deeds and talks will be recorded." From the poem, "You who have wronged." The greatest poets of our time, from Octavio Paz, Pablo Neruda, Bertolt Brecht, Mahmoud Darwish and Adonis, to Tagore, I Ching, Tim Chiha, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, are all united by what Paz calls the apocalyptic element that one finds in the poets we have cited, besides a range of poets from William Blake, Alexander Pushkin, Alexander Bloch, Paul Celan and Cesar Vallejo, to Paul Eluard, Zbigniew Herbert, Louis Aragon, Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Nassim Hikmat, Derek Walcott, Ko Un, Wisława Szymborska and Beidao, to cite just a few names. Their texts instantly make visible the now obscure links between mantic practices and poetry, between magic, shamanism, possession and oracle on the one hand, and poetic vision, inspiration, power and incantation on the other. The poet thus re-enchants the disenchanted world by turning poetry into a symbolic act intended to transform the world. This apocalyptic and symbolic function of poetry has assumed a new urgency in our time that, to me, has been marked primarily by violence in its diverse incarnations. Theodor Adorno, the well-known Frankfurt thinker, once said that poetry was impossible after Auschwitz. The statement clearly was not meant to be literal. It was an intense comment on the violence of our times that works against creativity of every kind. Indeed, the Holocaust produced its own variety of great poetry. Remember Nelly Sachs, Abba Kovner, Paul Celan, and several others who still remind us of those ominous days of the genocidal mania. It was about such poetry that Tadeusz Rosewicz had said in his introduction to the anthology of post-war Polish poetry, a poetry for the horror-stricken, for those abandoned to butchery, for survivors, created out of a remnant of words, salvaged words, out of uninteresting words from the great rubbish dump. The history of poetry in our time has also been a history of censorship, exile, and martyrdom. We have the examples of Lorca, Neruda, Nazim Hikmat, and Osip Mandelstam, Mayakovsky and Aiching, Shamsur Rahman and Benjamin Molloy and Kensaro Viva, Cherabanda Raju and Saroj Datta, Subbaravu Panigrahi and Saptar Hashmi, who had all raised their voice against some form of dictatorship, discrimination, and injustice for which they had to suffer insult, imprisonment, life in a labor camp, exile, or even death. Plato, who had kept poets out of his ideal republic, should be pleased that he has had several followers in our time, from Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and Idi Amin to Pinochet, Stalin, Pol Pot, Sani Abacha, Ayatollah Khomeini, Saddam Hussein, and many other champions of totalitarianism and authoritarianism and fundamentalism of diverse hues, and their tribe is on the increase, I need not tell you, with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Vladimir Putin, and Narendra Modi. At times, even avowed Democrats eager to defend the status quo. James Joyce once said of writers, "Excuse us, we are olives," meaning the writers yield their best under oppressive environments. While it is true that various forms of oppression have produced some of the most passionate poetic works of our time, it is equally true that they have also silenced a lot of real and potential poets. Brecht was right when he asked, "Will there be poetry in dark times?" and answered, "Yes, poetry about dark times." Remember, in his poem, "To the Posterity," he had bemoaned the cruel times when a talk about trees could be a crime, since it also carried a silence about injustice, though today we need to talk about trees and beasts too, while not being silent about human beings. It is impossible for a genuine writer today to ignore the violence that threatens to drown our beautiful world. Blood floods our bedrooms, and our drawing rooms are strewn with corpses, and that's often the blood and corpses of those who have neither drawing rooms nor bedrooms. Even the ivory towers of pure aesthetes are being swept by the winds of violence and change. Poets can no more be comfortable with ahistoricity, even if they transmute it, as Paz says, into apocalyptic visions. Violence in our time springs from so many sources. Indeed, there are the big and small wars, often engineered by divisive forces, imperialist agencies, and arms dealers. We have seen from Vietnam to Iraq how wars can be conjured up by hegemonic nation states and are fueled by blind and sectarian nationalism. Another form of violence springs from social inequalities of class, caste, race, and gender. Capitalist violence that emanates from greed and consequent exploitation. Capitalism comes into the world dripping blood, says Karl Marx, Upper caste violence as practiced even in contemporary India based on discrimination, denial of opportunities, and silencing of historical memory. The violence of the white races against the colored and non-tribal people and non-tribal people against tribal populations, and patriarchal violence that takes several forms from linguistic and emotional violence to the physical one against women, inevitably produce counter-violence from the victims who try to resist the violence from above. But even counter-violence, however sympathetic we are towards it, is also violence. And as Brett says, even anger against injustice contorts our human features. By now, any intelligent student of history knows that violence cannot end violence, and an eye for an eye only turns the whole world blind, to recall the words of Mahatma Gandhi, the greatest spokesman of non-violence in our times. We have seen this dark logic at work in the countries that sought to change their destiny through violence. They had to employ greater violence to sustain their regimes until some of them collapsed for lack of any means to know the truth. Why? To know even their own people's thoughts, as they had silenced all opposition by brute force, which is blindness of the worst kind. Another is communal violence, of which we have seen some rabid outbursts in our own country, India, recently. This happens when religion gets divorced entirely from ethics, congealed into dogma and fanaticism, and begins to create a scapegoat and other in its own image, held responsible for every suffering that one endures. It shows patriarchal proclivities, manufactures an artificial tradition and a distorted history, dismissing elements that do not suit its design, and uses racial symbols and archetypes to appeal to the popular unconscious. Thus, it is also a form of cultural and historical violence. This communalism shares with fascism its basic features, what Umberto Eco calls ur-fascism in his book, 5 Moral Pieces. One that sees dissent as betrayal, defines nation negatively to the exclusion of minorities, thus promoting xenophobia, fears difference, advocates action for the sake of action, rejects modernism, looks at pacifism as collusion with the enemy, scorns the weak, appeals to the middle classes, encourages the cult of death, upholds machismo as a value, and opposes all non-conformist sexual behavior, treats people as a monolith, derides parliamentary governments, promotes what George Orwell would call newspeak, that sees everything as black and white, and avoids any kind of intellectual subtlety and complexity, limits the tools available to critical thinking, and creates a cult of tradition, taking truth to be already known. Techno-fascism is another form of corrupt power, as it ruins our physical and spiritual environment, exploits the natural resources with no consideration for posterity, pollutes our air, earth, and water, and imposes on everything the tyranny of the rational, measuring everything in numbers and quantities, and rejects all that is incalculable, immeasurable, and unsayable, which is the very substance of poetry, as they are impossible to digitize. It also produces speed that Milan Kundera in his slowness calls the ecstasy of technology. The speed of modern life leaves little room for meditation or even the pleasure of reading and writing. He speaks about the need to retrieve that lost joy of slowness, of lying on the meadow, idly gazing at God's windows, a joy getting lost in the louder and faster entertainment provided by the machines. Another kind of violence comes from the market that forces the writer to be loud and to join the bidding in the culture market, while art demands subtlety, suggestion, and understatement. It is like a subterranean current that slowly works on the foundations, uproots the status quo values, and creates new ones. Market is the new Midas, turning everything it touches not into gold but into commodity, and artists who answer its temptations are sure to sell their soul to this Mephistophelian spirit. Baudrillard spoke of globalization as the greatest violence of our time, as it imposes cultural amnesia on its victims, forcing them to forget their indigenous traditions in art, culture, and knowledge, and turning them increasingly into unthinking mimics of the West. Local cultures are the repositories of culturally learned responses built up over thousands of years, from which poetry often draws its sustenance. Its loss is no less dangerous than the loss of genetic diversity. Western universalism is trying to drown the pluralistic and polyphonic cultural mosaic of countries like India. The agenda of globalization is monoculturation, that is, to homogenize and standardize cultures, whereas difference and diversity are the very soul of many cultures in the East. Globalization kills languages, both through jargonization and the selling of the monolingual idea. It is more a command from above than a decision from below. It anthropologizes culture by reducing ethnicity into a brand name. It is a form of recolonization that brings back colonial imaginaries. I conclude. Genuine poetry has always opposed violence in its direct and oblique, tangible as well as intangible forms, and more than ever, it needs today to raise its profoundly human voice against all forms of violence, the ones we spoke of and the ones we may have overlooked. Paz had foreseen the contemporary situation. I quote him, "Reality has cast aside all disguises, and contemporary society is seen for what it is, a heterogeneous collection of things homogenized by the whip or by propaganda, directed by groups distinguishable from one another only by the degree of their brutality. In these circumstances, poetic creation goes into hiding," unquote. Poetry, even with its element of play, is no mere combinatorial game and that a machine can play. It is more than a mere permutation of a restricted number of elements and functions. It always tries to say what it cannot say, and its power comes from its willingness to give a voice to what is voiceless and a name to what is nameless. It advances on the blank page. Poetry becomes important, not when it reproduces established values, given truths, or ready-made slogans. It is an ear that hears beyond the understanding of common sociology, an eye that sees beyond the color spectrum of everyday politics. It promotes self-awareness through a criticism of the status quo and the cultural and material violence it perpetrates. I'll just conclude. That we conclude with Paz's own inspired words. We must find the lost word, dream inwardly and also outwardly, decipher the night's tattooing, and look face to face at the noonday, and tear off the mask, so that finally we can say, "I am history, a memory inventing itself. I am never alone. I speak with you always. You speak with me always. I move in the dark. I plant signs." Thank you.
I'd like to thank, first of all, the Raza Foundation, the Embassy of Mexico, Santiago Rui for having contacted us, and Carlos Varona also, who motivated us to participate in this seminar on Octavio Paz. Now, my paper is on this book which he has written, Conjunctions and Disjunctions. And I'd like to highlight a few comparisons which he made with India and Mexico. Now, paradox and metaphor were Paz's twin instruments that he used in his comparison of different civilizations. In Conjunctions and Disjunctions, he explained pairs of contrasting concepts, the repressive and explosive, or eroticism and indifference that were manifested in different civilizations at different times. In Conjunctions, Paz also made clear that he was far from positing a time lag suffered by the East as contained its progress and evolution. And it's also important to say this because sometimes Paz has also been classed with other Westerners who have sought to understand India, and with the attendant prejudices which have often been ascribed to these people. So he says in this Conjunctions, "For the moment we can merely repeat that soul and body, face and sex organs, life and death are different realities that have different names in each civilization and therefore different meanings. This is not all. It is possible to translate the central terms of culture into those of another. Mukti is not really liberation, nor is nirvana extinction. When we seem to be speaking of the same things with an Arab or a Mexico, or an Eskimo, we may be speaking of different things, and it is not inconceivable that the opposite might also be true. Now, the methodology that Paz used was often taken from Claude Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, was his mentor. Like Lévi-Strauss, Paz had elaborated a universal syntax of civilizations. The combinations that he made with his experiences in India were structured under the rubrics of body and non-body. And with this, he began a series of comparisons. He found similarities between Tantric Buddhism and Protestantism, as both were movements, but if Buddhism was a commitment with Hinduism, Protestantism was a rupture with Christianity. While one was fusion, Tantric Buddhism, the other was a separatism, and this was clearly reflected in food habits. The Tantric banquet was an excess, while Protestant food was frugal. Together with the methodology Paz devised in conjunctions, he also used surrealism, curious juxtapositions, unusual images, and artistic conflations that he would draw to compare phenomena in Mexico and India. The Mexican poet and critic Adolfo Castañón has compared a passage on women from Sundra Kunda in the Ramayana, translated into Spanish by Juan Bergua, with a passage from Octavio Paz's work, The Monkey Grammarian, on the same subject. Castañón's objective is to illustrate the poetic reworking that Paz effected in his readings of Indian life and classical literature. In Figures and Figurations, a compilation of poems and sketches and photographs by Paz and his wife Marie-Jose, we come across the poem India. These letters and sinuous lines that entwine and separate on the paper are like the palm of a hand. Are they India? These are the lines from the book. Now, in The Monkey Grammarian, often considered a long poem, the hamlet of Galta is the setting for this work, but the narrative veers from Churchill College, Cambridge, to Aztec markets in historical Mexico City, back to the crumbling ruins of an old fort in a village on a side road from Agra to Jaipur. So the eye jumps from one image to the other, from different continents, different time periods. In another comparison, and now I go to another comparison from the Labyrinth of Solitude, and then I'll bring it back here to what he says about India. In Labyrinth of Solitude, Paz had analyzed the differences between the phenomenon of death in Mexico and other Western countries. According to Paz, it was thought that death defined life. He says, our deaths illuminate our lives. If our deaths lack meaning, so did our lives. If we do not die as we have lived, it is because the life we lived was not really ours, just as the bad death that kills us does not belong to us. For the ancient Aztecs, however, death was part of the creative process of life. It was a debt contracted by the species that had to be paid back to the gods. Since life never belonged to the Aztecs, neither did their death. Choices belonged only to the gods, who finally abandoned the Aztecs. According to Paz, the denial of death, as happens in the West, and which didn't happen in the Aztec civilization, means a denial of life. And for this reason, a killing is so different in the West as in comparison with other societies. In Mexico, they continue to exist. This was before the current period, to exist the old relation between assassin and victim, while in the West there were concentration camps with only objects and torturers. Discussing this in conjunctions and disjunctions, Paz proposed that perhaps reincarnation was a concept that helped Indians tolerate the reality of death. In any case, according to Paz, Buddhism did not believe in nihilism, for which death was an end. In his earlier diagnosis of Mexican society, Paz had explained that a denial of the past had occasioned its sense of solitude, alienation and orphanhood, of being on the margins of universal history. The Oedipus myth was manifested through the image of the violated mother, and all Mexicans were the sons and daughters of La Malinche, the Aztec woman and consort of Cortés. He cited the case of the Pachuco, the adopted North American society, who hid profound disquiets under his apparent pride. This solitude manifested itself as melancholy, or frenetic rejoicing in parties. Some opined that this insecurity was born of economic reasons, but according to Paz, even if all the economic reasons were to disappear, this would not help with cultural reasons. According to him, North Americans used reality They did not analyze it so profoundly as did the Mexicans. For the North Americans, the world could be perfected. For Mexicans, it had to be redeemed. In the analogy that he made with Indian society, Paz focused on the caste system that seemed to him to be like the dissimulation practiced by the Mexicans, the solitude which they practiced in order not to face the world. He says the caste system was a defense against the outside world. India controlled its diversity through an ingenious system that was born of the soil and based on nature and revolved around purity and food habits. In Hindi, the word means jati or species. This is from conjunctions and disjunctions that originated in the natural world with its variety of different kinds of plants and animals. Unlike as in the United States, what was sought was not a melting pot where all the races became one, but the integration of each particularity in a wider system, although one of the unfortunate consequences was the superiority of one over the other. He says it was also a way of fixing the fluidity of life in an atemporal structure. In the Hindu caste system, Paz found reflections of the Oedipus myth because there was no need to look for change externally. Diversity was denied because everything was found in the interior. The caste system was like the mother's womb that offered protection against change. For Western societies, change and the individual were important. However, in this context, Paz said that capitalist societies had created uniformity but not equality. And for this reason, it seemed to him to be hypocritical that they judged the caste system. Paz blamed modern society and capitalism for the lack of equality. At times, Paz has been described as one more Westerner interested in the East, but as we have seen, his categories of analysis differed considerably from that of the Orientalists. He was interested not only in ancient but also in contemporary India. He never positioned the East as a dichotomy with the West, and neither did he see the East as one homogeneous entity. His interest in Japan and its culture is well known. Within India, he highlighted the differences in references to Hindu temples, Islamic mosques, and Buddhist shrines. He never involved himself in the politics of others. In Mexico, his ideas did not have the purpose of reifying the Mexicans, but of finding for them a place in the world. He never ignored the fact that the Mexican character was a result of history. I'm saying all this because he doesn't fit into the plot of Orientalism. In history, there were to be found the answers to its enigmas. India attracted him because he immediately recognized its singularity, because Mexico was also like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gini. And it's very interesting because actually it has a lot of similarities with the essay of Bai, no? Right? Not like this double lecture of Labyrinth of Solitude and Light of India. And no, if you please address the proposal.
12 minutes is the limit. I already know that. So this is 4 parts. This article, this is called Transcendence of Love. First part is gift. What I am going to speak is a birthday gift to my son, Hutashan, who writes beautiful poems himself. 2, poet. I met Octavio Paz only once in year 1986 in the month of November, same month, maybe October. I left Bhopal in the night of Diwali, leaving my pregnant wife behind to go to Delhi, where Paz was going to deliver Nehru Memorial Lecture, India and Latin America Cultural Dialogue, which I later translated also. I was with Jagdish Swaminathan, a great painter. After the lecture, few people stood in a kind of line to meet Paz. The line had, apart from Swami and me, a great Hindi writer, Nirmal Verma, and a philosopher of his own kind, Ramchand Gandhi. You can just imagine the greatness of the line, except me, of course. When our chance came, I was introduced to Paz as a poet and a doctor, and he shook my hands. His skin felt like parchment, and said, well, both concerned with human suffering. Third part, this is poetry. I am reading few lines of a poem which, as Paz said, are intimately related to the book that I am later going to discuss. Art, this poem is called Letter of Testimony. The art of love, is it the art of dying? To love is to die and live again and die again. It is liveliness. I love you because I am mortal and you are. Love, reconciliation with the great all, and with the other, the small and endless all, to return to the day of origin, the day that is today. And then the fourth part is book. And the book is Double Flame. And this is a wonderful book. I think it's one of the finest books that he wrote. And Paz is trying to differentiate eroticism from love. And he's very, very almost clinical in doing so. And he talks about two extreme cases of eroticism. One is one he sees in Platonism, and another he sees in Bauddha Tantrism. And what he says, the difference between Tantrism and Platonism is instructive. The Platonic lover contemplates form, the body, without being tempted into an embrace. The yogi attains liberation through copulation. In one case, contemplation of form is a journey that leads to the vision of essence and participation in it. In the other, the ritual copulation requires the darkness of eroticism to be traversed and the destruction of the forms realized. The yogi aspires to abolish desire, and hence the contradictory nature of his attempt. It is an ascetic eroticism. It's a very strange, beautiful word. A pleasure that yogi denies himself. His experience is imbued with a sadism that is not physical but mental. Forms must be destroyed. In Platonism, the beloved body is untouchable. In Tantrism, what is untouchable is the spirit of the yogi. Therefore, he must tolerate, during the carnal embrace, all the caresses prescribed by the manuals of erotology, but while doing so, he must retain his semen. And if he succeeds in this, he achieves the indifference of the diamond. Although the difference between Platonism and Tantrism are profound, they contain radically different visions of the world and humankind. There is a point at which they meet. The other disappears. Now he talks about the love. He says, it is worth repeating the point, love is not search for the idea or essence. Neither is it path towards a state of transcending idea and non-idea, good and evil, being and non-being. Love seeks nothing beyond itself. No good, no reward. It does not pursue a final aim above it. It is indifferent to any sort of transcendence. It begins and ends in itself. Now there the problem rises to me. I think love too acquires the transcendence, but that is through the love poetry. That is through what in our tradition we call Raza. Well, it's very interesting that Paz never got interested into the poetics of India. He was deeply interested in the mystical traditions. He was deeply interested, in religious traditions of India, but he never ever got interested into one of the most finest poetic tradition, poetic theoretical traditions of India, which would have answered this question to him. So wherever he is, I am addressed to him. Love too acquires transcendence, but through poetry, through rasa. Now, there are 9 rasas, as most of you or some of you might be knowing. And rasa is like, the first word means the taste. But it is sensual and the spiritual at the same moment. So it is a taste, and so it means a kind of pleasure which is not definable, which is not measurable, as the word taste suggests. Now, Paz himself has suggested a poet, Alexandrian poet, Calutus, and he says that he writes love poetry and all. So deeply in love, when the lover writes either a poem or reads a poem, he enters into what is called Shringar Ras. And Shringar Ras is, the basis of the rasa is like there is some stable emotion, and that stable emotion is a very particular emotion of a particular human being. But the poetry transforms that particular emotion into an emotion of the universal. And that is what poetry does. And Shringar actually is also called the Rasaraj, which means the king of all other rasas. And the reason is that the stable emotion, the emotion on the basis of which this rasa is produced, is rati, which means this is based on the togetherness, it is based on some kind of sexuality, where Paz says that it is the basis of the love. Now this emotion of the rati, at the time of the experience of rasa, is transformed into Shringar, but you know, rati is present in each and every living being. So at the time of experience of rasa, in the poet or in the reader, the continuum with the nature is experienced. You feel at that point, when you are feeling this, experiencing the rasa of a poetry, that you have become everyone. Abhinav Gupta, you know, the 10th century great thinker, he once said that at the time of experience of rasa, you pass through a stage which he called aparimit pramatritva. Aparimit is limitless, pramatritva means witnessness. So you become an infinite witness. So at the time of experience of Shringar Ras, which love has led either a reader or a writer to, this experience of Shringar, the poet or the reader experiences what Abhinav Gupta is calling aparimit pramatritva, which means that he transcends his individual ego and becomes one with the everything around that. So that is one movement when the individual ego is shorn off and he or she herself becomes everything, and only by becoming everything he or she experiences the continuum with the nature. So the moment of the rasa, experience of the Shringar rasa or the love poetry, is the moment when you transcend the state as an individual and you become one with the universe. Thank you.
Well, I know that in Spanish there is a phrase called "lo bueno es lo breve es dos veces bueno." But I have been a professor in a university, used to the podium and the mic, and have never been good in that sense. Brevity. 12 minutes. Octavio Paz. Well, I wanted to tell you, talk about certain, what I call personal anecdotic encounters with Pazian situations. I call them Pazian situations. I never met Paz, but did come into contact with a lot of his writings and started taking interest in him from 1980s onwards when I was in Mexico, in El Colegio de Mexico. Unfortunately, I had an opportunity to meet him, but I couldn't utilize him because he was in great controversy with another great professor at that time, talking about a particular letter of a great Mexican nun, Sor Juana de la Cruz, and this professor claimed it to be his find, and Octavio Paz was claiming that to be his find, and there was a great controversy. I was in fact favoring this professor called Elias Trabuls, so I never went to Octavio Paz, in spite of the fact that I got an opportunity. What a foolish thing young people commit, at times.
Anyway, talking about these Pazian situations, you know, I have a long paper, but all this is also mentioned in the article, long article that I have in the book. These Pazian situations refer to my encounters with certain problems raised by situations, by people talking about Paz's themes. You know, I was in Argentina once giving a lecture on Paz, and after the lecture, one of these porteros, you know, doorman, came and told me, "Sir, do you think Paz is a Latin American poet?" Well, he raised a very, after all that I had said, trying to underline his transcendence from a person from a particular identity, a Mexican, a Latin American, to his universal nature, and all that I had talked about. So he thought that he was more a universal poet, and his identity as a Mexican or a Latin American had been lost. So I came back home, I sent him certain poems, writings of Paz in order to show that no, he was certainly a Mexican poet, but I do not know what impact it made. That was the first Pazian situation I encountered. I remember I sent him Cosante. That's a very interesting poem about a nightingale who is talking about his singing, how it is affected because it is seated on a particular wall and is bleeding and can't sing. It's a very specific situation, historical situation of Mexico, of Latin America. So this was my first situation. The second situation was again in another lecture which I was giving in New York, where I was talking about the problem of continuity in Paz, break and rupture, whether Paz coming to India was a break from the past, whether there was a rupture. And I was trying to say that, as many critics have said, that there is an Oriental classical phase of Paz, and then there is a complete rupture after he comes to India. So I was trying to say, no, that is not true. Paz has all the elements of receiving the Indian component right from the very beginning, and I was trying to produce some proof documents about his early writings with Elena Garro, letters that he had written, his discussions with Mario Rosa de Luna, Adolfo Castañón, a very well-known writer. He had analyzed these early influences of Indian thought or Oriental thought already present in Paz when he was discussing in the earlier pre-30 stages along with his first wife in all those letters. And there a lady comes up and informs me that all these letters, all these documents had now been passed over to Princeton University, and you can go and check what you are saying can be verified very well in all these. Of course, I did not have the resources to go and check in the Princeton University. I did contact the librarian and did check some of those documents where I think what I was trying to say was right. Now, there were so many other Pazian situations. I don't have the time to do it. What I wanted to, in a great hurry, I would like to conclude with is another encounter after 6 or 7 of these kinds of encounters. During the last year, during the last 6, 7 months, 8 months, I had been reading the origins of Bengali literature and Bengali poems. And there I find a very, the first most well-known document about the origin is called Charjapad. Now, Charjapad, while reading it, I could not understand the Pali and the Sanskrit language used in it, so I went into the translation, and the translation, the first translation was done by Muhammad Sahidullah in early United Bengal in 1928, and there he had given a translation of many of the padas, Charjapad, of Charjapad. In fact, this was a find made by Hariprasad Shastri in 1907 in the Nepal Royal Court. And there, from there starts the discussion about the origin of Bengali literature. Now, to my surprise, in the English translations, I find something that's, that reverberated in my mind, that I thought that I had, these philosophical thoughts, these questions of dissolution of the yes and no, of the signification and no signification, of many such, of reality and illusion, of going from of expression to silence, all these, where did I see, where did I find? So I knew that I had found them in Paz, and then I started going through Paz again, and I found in his Versiones y Diversiones a footnote where he shows that he had studied, he had seen Muhammad Shahidullah's book and read it and gone through it. And then I find that he is making a mention in Versiones y Diversiones, in this book, he is talking about two very important Charjapad poets who wrote in the tradition of the Charjapad, Saraha and Kanha. Now, these two poets then Paz in his Vislumbres has stated very clearly that he was very interested in translating these early Bengali poems in Bengali. He did not understand, but he had plans to do it when he comes back again. But that never happened, but he had plans to do it. When this Versiones y Diversiones was published again in 1982, these notes were still there. But later, I think in the 1987 or 1992 version, those footnotes had disappeared, that he had seen Saraha and Kanha's poetry and he wanted to translate them. That had disappeared. Now, what is the essence of this? What I want to say is, how much? 5 minutes?
3 minutes.
3. Now, the whole problem of this Charjapad tradition, it's a collection of mystical poems, songs of realization of the Sahajya Vajrayana tradition of Buddhism, from the Tantric tradition during the Pali Empire in ancient Assam, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Now, in these poems, as Muhammad Shahidullah suggests, the poems go back to the 7th and 8th century, although Hariprasad Shastri talks about it, that they belong to the 9th or 10th century, but he says that it is 7th and 8th century. Now, there, this whole idea of sunyata, of vacuity, through, in human experiences, is very much present. There is, in all the erotic imageries, and this is in continuation of what the earlier speaker was talking about, in all the erotic imageries, there is a high philosophical content. The tantric tradition of treating the body as a forest, complicated forest with so many ramifications, and which has to be explored through means which will resolve this problem of prudence versus sensuality. Now, this conflict between prudence or wisdom versus sensuality, that is resolved in these poems. And that I had brought a whole lot of examples of these poems, which are very, very similar to what Paz, uses in the idea of the vacuity when, through the erotic experience of a man and woman, of this sexual unity, which in the tantric tradition, which resolves the problem of death and birth, death and life, by, for example, holding this sexual act in, on the ashes of the cemetery, of the cremation ground, ashes of the cremation ground. Now, why is this done? In order to understand that this whole act of copulation, this whole erotic act, is nothing but there is another kind of a philosophical presence beyond the sexual act, which goes much beyond knowledge. We cannot say it in words. Therefore, in Paz, for example, when he gives an interview to Braulio Perales and Poniatowska, two very interviews he gives, and he talks about this idea of words going up to a point. Después del saber hay silencio. There is, after knowledge, there is complete silence. In that silence, one resolves so many conflicts. That is why Buddha propagated this whole idea of niravata, or silence totally after a certain time. There is no answer to certain questions. Now, these are some of the ideas raised in Charjapad poetry. In line after line, verse after verse, you find expressions which are very close to what Paz has tried to project. And there are, an important Bengali journalist, Alok Ranjan Dasgupta, when Paz met him in Paris, he told him, I have full intention of translating Bengali poetry, particularly of the Kavya tradition, but I'll do it sometimes. I'll have to go back to it. That is absolute necessity for me. But that occasion did not arrive. Now, I am at present, this is the last encounter. This is the most recent encounter. It is an anecdotic encounter in which now I am discussing it with certain Bangladesh, if not specialists, but they have complete knowledge of what Sahidullah wrote, Muhammad Sahidullah wrote, and they are also aware of Paz's creation, and I am in constant discussion with them and trying to find out. I don't have the resources to go from Paris to Princeton in order to, and Mexico to find out from the archives all these details, but we are working out. On the basis of this, I am absolutely sure that this relation between the early Bengali poetry of the Charjapad and Pas's use of the tantric tradition in his poems, particularly of Sunyata, of vacuity, it can be established beyond doubt. Thank you very much.
How many subjects have been addressed? No? I think that there is at least 2 lines. Sorry. So, thank you for that movie. I think many subjects have been addressed. And I think at least 2 lines that could trigger a discussion. I've seen some reactions on the public after we could also hear from different reactions to your own pieces. Or, well, I think one of the main things is understanding history through the lenses of poetry. And I think there was something really important in the past work is the essay on India is published almost 20 years after actually being here in India. So his main tool to understand is poetry, and that's how we have, of course, Eastern Slav. And another thing is, and this is not something I said, but Elion Weinberger, is that the influence of India in past poetry is not the most obvious. It's not in the poems on India. It's perhaps white, blanco, that is very important.
Yes.
And the second line, and I would love to hear also from the audience, is, and this is also something that was discussed in the last session on Saturday, is that at the end of the day, the journey of Paz in India is also a love story. And Marie-Jo Paz, who died 4 months ago, she was aware that this was going to happen, and it was something really, really special for her. She had, we had all of her support, and suddenly, there is a lot of anniversary, and I don't want to be the guy who pushed to commemorate the anniversary of the anniversary, but we do have, the 20th anniversary of the death of Octavio Paz. Also the 50 years after he left India, and of course, a few months back, the death of Marie-Jo Paz. Is there any comment you would like to add to what has been said? No. Thank you. Mr. Bashir, it's enough. Any question, any comment? Yes. Can someone help me with the mic? It's in.
spirituality, our spirituality, is it meant is it more a prayer or is it more sacrifice in the long run?
I don't know.
Yes, you address, but I'm sure you have a,
I don't know.
some
I
kind
can't
of
define poetry. I don't want to.
maybe. Well, actually, in the book, no.
Yes, yes.
Maybe you.
No. I don't have an answer. Sachi will do.
Well, I'm gonna answer quoting Mr. Kudayan, who is next to me, quoting Paz. No? But maybe you should read it because you will read it much better than myself.
Okay. What do you
This
want?
one, a poem. What is
A
not
poem,
poetry,
a
but a
poem
poem.
is an object. This is what Paz wrote. A poem is an object fashioned out of language, rhythms, beliefs, and obsessions of a poet and a society. It is the product of a definite history and definite society, but its historical mode of existence is contradictory. The poem is a device which produces anti-history, even though this may not be the poet's intention. The poetic process inverts and converts the passage of time. Poem does not stop time. It contradicts and transfigures it. Yeah.
Why did you choose that quote?
Well, that was very significant for me at that age. I was 18-year-old starting to write, and I was trying to understand why should one write poem, and what should one do while you are a poet, because writing poetry is not a vocation that comes naturally, in the society, every society. Poets are odd men out, odd women out. So that's why it was a great help to me to understand that this was one of the ways that poetry can be looked at. Of course, as I grow older, I feel that something more is to be needed, should be added to that, but I don't know what should be needed. So therefore, so that's it. Thank you. Go ahead.
In the meantime, I would like to do a little advertisement. You are around exhibition of 48 Indian and Mexican graphic designers, inspired by the quotes of Octavio Paz. In this section there is a letter of belief, no?
Yes.
Which was a poem quoted
by me.
I'm also, we are sharing the table with two persons that have, the main focus hasn't been Octavio Paz in their academic work. So, Carlos Fuentes, in Dr. Soani case, and where, Mr. Ganguly has explored many other Mexican and Latin American authors. So, if you want to, could you please comment on, perhaps, how is your approach, to Carlos Fuentes, and how this is related to the story of Octavio Paz?
Well, since I've been asked to, I will give a brief summary of how first I came across Carlos Fuentes, who was also initially a friend of Octavio Paz, and then they drifted apart because of ideological reasons. And well, my approach was that I started reading Carlos Fuentes because of his novel Where the Air is Clear, which deals with Mexico City. Now, with Carlos Fuentes, you see, as we start studying an author, we gradually discover certain disquiets which arise in one's own mind. Now, I came to Octavio Paz after that. Octavio Paz is much more difficult than Carlos Fuentes. Yeah. It requires a reading which has to be honed with time and experience. So when I came back to India, then I started looking at Octavio Paz. I began, Labyrinth of Solitude is easy. The other works, especially the ones which deal with India, have to be read and reread. And if one's knowledge of Indian philosophy is a bit wanting, then one has to go back again to Indian philosophy. Though I do think that Paz's perspective was more to understand Mexico all the time. That was my thing, that it was a better way. He studied India in order to understand Mexico better. His first, he's been criticized criticized very often for not dealing with India adequately and not consulting the right bibliographic material. But his intention was never that. That's my answer.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, no, if another comment. Ah, great.
I would really like to know what made Octavio Paz join the Foreign Service. Because nobody remembers any diplomat so immensely around the world as we do Bangladesh, India, other countries too. Why did he join the world of diplomacy? I would just love to know that. He was immensely vast. I mean, he was a much greater man than a diplomat. I don't think any diplomat has known the world over. They celebrate now, here. And I remember I was a college going girl and I used to see he was representing as an ambassador to his country in India, and I would see his card lying on my father's table. And that, when the first time Octavio Paz's talk and lecture at the King House was there, I thought, oh my God, this is the same person who was the diplomat here. I couldn't understand how the diplomat is giving such an oratorial lecture. And now, when somebody from the Mexican embassy tells me what made you join the
And so was Carlos Fuentes.
Yes, he was the son of a diplomat.
Yeah.
But it was never a political post.
I
He
can ask,
got it through his closeness to the president.
I wrote
See,
a
there
small
were flaws
biography
in Carlos
of
Fuentes.
Paz, and I asked
Personality
him, so
flaws.
there's a story. He was a very poor student, and he was having a scholarship, one of the first Guggenheim scholarships in the United States. And he was invited to be a visiting professor in literature, and he had the opportunity to become a member of the Foreign Service in Mexico, which is really, in Mexico, part of a long tradition of having important intellectuals belonging to the Foreign Service. The biggest of all of them before Octavio Paz was Alfonso Reyes.
Yes.
And Alfonso Reyes was almost a godfather of Octavio Paz.
That's right.
And at the time, to belong to the Foreign Service for a writer was the opportunity to become someone who makes something for his country, and at the same time makes something for his own world, because you have the distance to see your country from afar. And in fact, I do think that if Octavio Paz was not a diplomat, he would never have the point of view so linked to a more intellectual point of view linked to surrealism. But more than surrealism, he got in touch with surrealism because he was a diplomat in Paris. But more than that, he was in touch with the thinking of André Masson and the whole labyrinth of solitude. This name, thanks to what was called the College of Sociology. So he was there, and then he was in touch with the last moment of the surrealism. So he was able to, as I was explaining the day before here, he was in touch with the avant-gardes. He came to Mexico and he changed the mentality. He stopped being himself a real socialist. He changed the mentality, introduced Mexico to the modernity. And all of that because he was a diplomat. He was able to do that. And then he worked in Mexico, he came to India, he changed, also introduced modernity in India too. So thanks to being a diplomat, he was able to do many things. I can tell you that besides studying him, I worked with him as managing editor of his magazine. When I began to work with him, he gave me a very bad advice. And he said to me, I will give you the advice I received from Alfonso Reyes. Alfonso Reyes told him, the administrative work, do it very quickly, even if you do it very fast. Because you are a writer. But I can tell you, and all the people who studied all his letters and studied how his diplomatic work was, he didn't obey the advice. He really was a very high working person. I can tell you that. When I worked with him, he was the oldest in all the group and in all the company publishing the magazine, and he was the one who worked most. And well, being a diplomat is something important in Mexico. It's really something that gives you the opportunity of having a different point of view. I wanted to tell you to finish what I began yesterday, but also to make a link with what is happening here today. That as a Mexican writer, for me, it's very important and very impressive to hear all your opinions. It's really it's a teaching. You are teaching me many things. And I think that in different degrees, all of you are correct. Of course, as you said, Octavio Paz was not a typical Orientalist, because he never thought of himself as a Westerner. When you are Mexican and you live in Paris as a diplomat, you never think of yourself as a French, as a British, as an American. You think of yourself as someone from the South. And he came to India. He was establishing not a link between a Westerner and Orient. He was making a link between someone from the South in a Southern country. Because the link with the North is, the countries of the North, is a link of power. The important difference is not Western, Occident, it's North, South. And that you learn in your diplomacy. So Octavio Paz was really identified with that. And India changed his poetics. And what Mr. Ganguly said, I think that he's right, that he knew a lot about India. But it was an intellectual idea. It was an intellectual way of understanding. He was influenced as an idea. But when he came here, everything changed in a more complete way. I mean, India transformed his poetics. First, when he knew about India, that transformed his ideas, some of his ideas. But then all his poetics, I mean, all his way of understanding poetry, in a whole, as a whole, was changed. And the third change that he had is, almost when he died, because in the biography of Octavio Paz, it's a very critical moment when his library was had an accident and burned. But people don't know, you didn't know his apartment, that in fact the library never burned. The library was next after a yard. What he really lost and really modified all his will of living was that the burning place was the
I have a question for Arturo. Wasn't Jorge Cuesta also influenced him? Didn't Jorge Cuesta influence him along with Alfonso Reyes? Because that's what he states also in Vislumbres.
Alfonso Reyes was another generation.
Very senior.
Even from Cuesta. But Cuesta was like the older brothers of Octavio Paz generation. And in fact, the first person who wrote about Octavio Paz, about his first book, was Jorge Cuesta. And in a beautiful, understanding way, all the boys from Octavio Paz generation said, Octavio Paz is copying this boy. Octavio Paz is copying Lorca, for example. And Jorge Cuesta wrote, thanks to Octavio Paz, Lorca will survive.
Right.
Just
Just to add to something that Madam here asked, in that generation, many of these great poets wanted to be diplomats. Neruda, for example. He was placed here in the eastern, part of the world, in an island as Colombo, and then I think Malaysia also. And he desperately wrote to many people in Chile, higher ups, so that they could transfer him to Spain, their embassy in Spain, so that he could meet all the great poets there. All the great poetic activity was happening in Spain at that time, and he tried his best to go to Spain. So, great poets have used this channel to, to expand their scope and tell the whole world about their creative ability. So that has helped. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for creating this event. I now request Raza to present the decoration to Professor Muli.
Well, she has come back in the sense. She might do that.
Esteemed Madam Ambassador of Ethiopia, Excellencies, distinguished friends, I take this opportunity to convey my deepest gratitude to the Mexican government once again and to Her Excellency Senora Victoria in person
singular honor. I consider this prestigious conferment by the President of Mexico as a recognition of a wider ambit of Indian scholars. Well, I heard of this most gracious consideration in mid-August when I was in USA with our younger daughter. In fact, I was quite self-confined in the distance, contemplating on the option of moksha, goaded by the noise of a nationalistic narrative in our country about our great tradition which defined our duties at different stages of life. I was already 70. However, amidst other small pleasures, my intimate interaction with the 2.5-year-old grandson kept me off from that thought. But Ambassador Melodia's telephone call was like lightning that ended all my dharmic pretensions of renunciation. It sparked the desire to continue what I was humbly doing in the last 5 decades as a student of Hispanism and Latin Americanism, in which Spanish in Mexico, among other great countries from that part, figured prominently. Being among the first generation people to promote that cultural and literary activity in my country from the cradle of Jawaharlal Nehru University, it was a passion-filled engagement with hundreds of students, dozens of institutions, and agents of culture, scores of themes focusing beyond the areas defined by our English-dominated colonial history. On an occasion like this, I also want to remember with gratitude some of my mentors who influenced me at different stages. Fortunate to have enjoyed the support of caring parents with modest means, and that for a family at later stages. In my career, it was a huge blessing to have enjoyed the mentorship of stalwarts like Amartya Sen, Sisi Kumar Das, Dr. Day, Antonio Bilimenis Sagrea from India, Carlos Gonzalo, Elena Capena from Spain, Victor Urquidi, Antonio Valatorre, Carlos Marquez from Mexico, amongst others. Certainly, my ambition was not to become number one like them. That was perhaps a far cry. But as one character from the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño would say, number one is a very lonely figure. So it was a good feeling to be one amongst many ones, in the sense of collaboration work as far as possible, in teaching, research, and publications. I cannot forget the debt I owe to institutions like El Colegio de Mexico and UNAM in promoting this spirit further. Certainly, in our area of work, this couldn't have been possible without ease, without the active support and interest of diplomatic missions. I am particularly beholden to ambassadors like Her Excellency Neuropia and a few more, who seem to be fulfilling the criteria proposed by the great Peruvian poet and social activist Cesar Vallejo. In one of his pieces, he greatly appreciated the work of those diplomats at high places who carried out their mission of international cooperation, not under the bright lights of royal courts, but under the luz diabolica, or the tangential light that passed through commoners' platforms, in which I was engaged. To conclude, I fervently hope that the order of Aztec Eagle Conferment's real message will be heard loud and clear by all serious scholars working in the field towards goals that engaged me in my pursuit in spite of hurdles of many kinds. We have the great example of Octavio Paz, who endeavored so assiduously to engage with India sentimentally and intellectually for building bridges between the self and the other. Finally, is my granddaughter here? Yes, she's here. As a very small token of appreciation for holding this event, especially for me, let me request my granddaughter Tista, and also the grandson, the youngest representation of the future generation with interest in Spanish and Latin America, to offer a bouquet of flowers to Her Excellency Ms. Milwaukee.